So I was visiting my grandpa the other day. If you've been watching my channel for any amount of time, you know him. He's the Protestant grandpa who is not happy with my conversion. I've done an interview with him. You can go check that out. But I was visiting him and my grandma the other day, and we were discussing theology. And after I answered some of his questions, he asked me, so then why does the Catholic Church have such a bad reputation? And I answered, well, because it's been lied about for generations and generations, and those lies have become believed. And it's very hard to undo that, except very slowly, person by person, piece by piece. And so this video is the first video in a series where I will be tackling common misconceptions about Catholicism. These are misconceptions that we run into all the time when I do response videos. And I figured rather than responding to these misconceptions every single time they pop up in a response video, why not just make a standalone playlist of videos tackling all of them once and for all? So after these series, I better never hear these misconceptions mentioned by anybody ever again because I've already answered it. If only it worked that way. And the way I'm going to tackle this series is each video will have a category or a theme. So the theme of this video is going to be evil things that the Catholic Church has allegedly done or is currently doing allegedly. And this is a topic that's important to me because when I first told people about my conversion to Catholicism, a lot of the response I got from family and friends who are Protestants was, well, what about these evil things that the Catholic Church has done in the recent or distant past or is currently doing? How could you possibly join after knowing this? And in this video, I'm going to tackle 3 of the most common examples that are given as accusations against the Catholic Church that are proof that it is evil or something. And so accusation number 1 is the Catholic Church manipulates parishioners out of money to make itself rich. Number 2, the Catholic Church has historically committed atrocities like the Crusades and Spanish Inquisition. And number 3, child abuse is rampant in the Catholic Church. Let me say from the outset, these are all false. And I'm going to go through one by one and explain how they are false. So accusation 1, the Catholic Church manipulates parishioners out of money to make itself rich. This is something I've heard online in comment sections of YouTube videos where Protestants think that we have to pay money for indulgences or something. And I've also heard this accusation from Hosier, if you remember my video responding to his songs where he criticizes the Catholic Church, because Hosier thinks that the Catholic Church has gotten rich off the backs of poor people who they've manipulated out of money. But if we just look at the evidence and see how the Catholic Church makes money, how much money it makes, and how much money it spends on charitable causes, we'll see that this characterization is flat out false. Now, the church does encourage people to donate to their local parish, to support the local parish's charitable activities, to support the ministers who carry out the worship services and many other community activities. And we can see this in official church documents. For example, in canon law, we have quotes like this one, which says, "The Christian faithful are obliged to assist with the needs of the church so that the church has what is necessary for divine worship, for apostolic works, and works of charity, and for the decent sustenance of ministers." Canon law also states elsewhere, quote, "The faithful are free to give offerings for the needs of the church, but they are not to be compelled to do so." So canon law is clear that we should, in fact, we are obliged to be giving to the church to support its activities, but we should not be compelled to do so. That is, the church should not be forcing us to do so at the threat of excommunication or some other such consequences. So does this prove that the Catholic Church is manipulating people out of their money to make itself rich? Well, no. First off, if Catholicism is true, then the work of the church is the most important work being done anywhere on the planet. I mean, just think about it. If Catholicism is true, that means the Catholic Church delivers the means of grace, the means of the forgiveness of sins to the world, such as baptism, such as the sacrament of reconciliation, such as the Eucharist. These are things that have eternal consequences when we partake in them. And if that is true, then this is very important stuff that we need to make sure remains a possibility and remains functional so that we can receive this and others can receive this. Like it or not, there is a financial aspect to making sure that that can continue to happen. But then you might say, well, then wouldn't the church be financially incentivized to convince people that Catholicism is true so that they would give it money and make it rich? Again, no. And we can see that this is not happening when we just look at how the church is making and spending its money. And while exact figures are hard to come by, it's estimated that tens of billions of dollars are brought in by the Catholic Church every year from donations. Now, that's a ton of money, but no single person or group of people are in control of all of that. Instead, those funds are mostly used at the local parish level where they were received in the first place. Other sources of income for the church that are not donation-based are things like school tuition, healthcare fees, literature sales, real estate. So through donations and these other means that I just mentioned, it's clear that the church brings in a lot of money, but it doesn't just hold on to it. And if we look at how much money clergy like priests are making, we know that this money isn't just being hoarded to make them rich. According to sources like LinkedIn, ZipRecruiter, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, priests make about $40,000 to $50,000 per year. That's not terrible, but it's also not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. And this is around half of the salary of the average American pastor. According to salary.com, those pastors make around $108,000 per year. Meanwhile, priests, bishops, and even cardinals make about $40,000 to $60,000 per year. And the Pope doesn't receive a salary at all. And you might say, well, sure, the Pope doesn't receive a salary, but he lives in the Vatican. He lives in luxury. That's not true either. Pope Francis, one of the things I really like about Pope Francis is that he chooses not to live in the apostolic palace. Instead, he lives in a guest house in the Vatican. Also, priests, bishops, and cardinals tend to live in rectories in the parish which they are serving, which I'm sure is fine, but it's probably not some luxurious mansion. All of this is to say, while the church makes a lot of money in donations, and we should donate to our churches, this is not being used to enrich the clergy in some corrupt manner. Okay, so the money isn't being used to enrich priests, bishops, cardinals, or even the Pope. So what is it being used for? According to a 2012 article in The Economist, the church spends about $170 billion per year on charitable activities. This includes healthcare networks, colleges, daily parish operations, national charitable activities, food banks, shelters, disaster relief, education, orphanages, elderly homes, pregnancy centers. All of these activities that the church carries out throughout the world makes it the largest charitable organization in the history of the world. And it's not even close. So you might say, okay, but what about when I heard how the church was selling indulgences when people were having to pay money for the forgiveness of sins? What was that all about? Is that still going on? No, it's not still going on. So first we should note that charging money for indulgences was never an official church practice. Priests who were accepting money for indulgences were doing so against the church's teaching. They were doing so in disobedience to the church. And the Council of Trent definitively condemned this practice in 1563. Now, indulgences themselves are still a valid practice, but accepting money for them was never something that the church recognized. So you might say, what is an indulgence and where is that in Scripture? Let's talk about it. Indulgences are for sins that have already been forgiven, but still may carry some temporal punishment. In other words, you've committed a sin, you've been forgiven of it, God will not hold it against you, it will not separate you from God for eternity, but there still may be some temporal punishment that will come along with it for the sake of cleansing you of an attachment to that sin, for the sake of making you realize the gravity of that sin, or something like this. And we do see this in Scripture. For example, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, after King David repented of his sin of adultery and murder, the prophet Nathan tells him that God forgave him, but David still faces temporal consequences, such as the death of his son. So this demonstrates that even when sin is forgiven by God, there can still be temporal punishments in this life. For a New Testament example, we can look to Luke chapter 19. When Zacchaeus, the tax collector, repents, he voluntarily offers to make restitution for his sin by giving half his possessions to the poor and repaying those whom he defrauded. In response to this, Jesus declares that salvation has come to Zacchaeus' house, affirming that acts of penance and restitution are part of the repentance process. Likewise, now we can be saved from the eternal consequence of our sins, that is, separation from God, by confessing those sins, as is stated in 1 John chapter 1, verse 9, and we can avoid temporal consequences by performing indulgenced acts. For a more in-depth explanation of indulgences, I'm going to leave a link in the description to a YouTube channel called Divine Mercy. They have a lot of good explainer videos over there, so check that out if you want to know more about indulgences. Now, the second common accusation against the Catholic Church is that it has committed evil atrocities in its past, such as the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition. It might surprise you to hear me say this, but the Crusade and the Spanish Inquisition were actually good things that the Catholic Church did that featured some evil acts at the hands of Catholics, but the Crusades themselves were good and the Spanish Inquisition itself was good, even if at times people got carried away and went off track. Let's just start with the Crusades. So the first Crusade was called by Pope Urban II, and this was in response to several hundreds of years of aggression from Islamic militaries that were taking over Christian countries and forcing everybody to convert to Islam. By the time Pope Urban II called the First Crusade, Islamic militaries had already taken over Syria, Egypt, Palestine, Jerusalem, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Carthage, Spain, Portugal, Sicily, southern Italy, and significant portions of Asia Minor. And like I said, this had been going on for hundreds of years. So the First Crusade was an effort to defend against this aggression and reclaim some of the territory that had been taken, where Christians were now being oppressed and forced to convert. I think if anything, the craziest part of the First Crusade was that it took so long for it to be called. Now, there were 9 crusades in total, and all of them were for the same reason, to reclaim captured lands from Islamic militaries or to defend against Islamic aggression. And it's ironic that for all the anti-colonial talk nowadays, nobody digs up the history of conquest and forced conversions at the hands of Islamic militaries. Yet the Catholic Church has still to this day criticized for defending itself against such atrocities. Now don't get me wrong, bad things did happen at the hands of Catholics during the Crusades. Most notably, they sacked Constantinople and attacked Eastern Orthodox Christians. This happened during the Fourth Crusade, which was originally called by Pope Innocent III to reclaim the Holy Land. But what's important to note about this is that this was never the goal of this crusade. Pope Innocent did not want any crusaders to go and attack Constantinople or any Eastern Orthodox Christians. Just like in the case of selling indulgences, whereas if the priests would have just obeyed church teaching, they would have never fallen into that corruption in the first place. So too here, if the Crusaders had just obeyed the Pope and carried out the plan that was in front of them, they would have never committed these atrocities in the first place. So we see it's not the church that is officially instructing people to do this, it is people doing this in defiance of the church. And if they had submitted more to the church, if they had been more Catholic, they wouldn't have done these things in the first place. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was called in 1478 in order to evaluate claims of heresy against recent converts from Judaism and Islam. This was just after Spain was reclaimed from Islamic rule. And at this time, there was some social tension because lifelong Christians were accusing recent converts of only claiming to convert for social benefit while still practicing their old religion. This led to unrest and frequent, usually unwarranted, accusations of heresy. So the Inquisition was a way to evaluate these accusations with a trial using evidence rather than just going on random witch hunts. One thing noted by Brian Holdsworth in his video where he tackles this subject, the Inquisition only had authority over Christians. So if you were a Muslim or a Jew, the Inquisition didn't really care what you were doing because you weren't a Christian, and the Inquisition was only for evaluating whether or not Christians were committing heresy. Another thing that's often misunderstood about the Inquisition is people usually say that there was some crazy death toll, that millions and millions of people were killed for heresy. This was a claim I refuted in a video earlier on where a Protestant said that millions of people were burned alive for denying that the Eucharist was the true body and blood of Christ. Did not happen. In fact, the highest estimate for how many people were killed in the 350 years of the Spanish Inquisition is 5,000. And you might say, well, 5,000 people, that's still a lot of people that were killed by the church for heresy or alleged heresy. But the thing is, the church didn't kill anybody. During the Spanish Inquisition, all the church did was render a guilty or innocent verdict. If the accused were guilty, the church handed them off to the local authorities, the secular government, and the government decided what to do with them. But even before that, the church would seek to correct them and bring them back into the church and say, look, you've got this wrong. We would like you to correct your theology and come back and rejoin us. But if they refused to do so, or if they were repeat offenders, then they were handed over to the local authorities, who were the ones that delivered the sentence and carried it out. And out of the 200,000 accusations that the church weighed in their trials, like I said, only about 5,000 of them were eventually sentenced to execution by the secular government, which means a very, very small portion of people were actually found guilty, or if they were found guilty, a very small portion of them were sentenced to death. Without the judicial process that the church brought in, which weighed these cases based on evidence, that number could have been a lot higher. Because if the church wasn't weighing these cases, then it would have been a local magistrate who is not necessarily an expert on theology and would likely not be able to reliably know whether someone is committing heresy or not. So the Inquisition could have actually saved a ton of lives. Also, accusations that were found to be false resulted in punishment of the accuser. So if someone accused you of heresy and the Inquisition found that you were not, in fact, guilty, your accuser would get in trouble, which I think is a good idea. Now, the last accusation I want to tackle in this video is a big one. It's very common. I hear it all the time from family and online in comment sections, and that is that child abuse is rampant in the Catholic Church. This is false, and before we get into why it's false, I want to explain none of what I'm about to discuss in this section is meant to downplay the issue of child abuse in the church or is meant to excuse this in any form. Anybody who has done this should be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. I don't care who they are or what level of authority they have in the church. So let's just have that out there from the get-go. Now, with that said, let's talk about it. I often hear from Protestants that the prohibition on priests getting married leads to them preying on young children, but that is simply not backed up by the data. According to an article in Psychology Today, this is just one of many myths surrounding priests and the safety of children in the church. That same article goes on to explain that about 4% of Catholic clerics had credible accusations against them of child abuse. And while record keeping is not as clear in Protestant churches, if you are to look at insurance claims against Protestant churches, the rate is about the same. In fact, this article says, quote, there is no difference between Catholic and non-Catholic groups when it comes to rates of child abuse. So if a Protestant wants to accuse Catholic churches of being unsafe for children, then you'd have to say the same is true for Protestant churches. And according to a study conducted by the U.S. Department of Education, about 6% of public school teachers had credible accusations against them. So during the same time period, we have 4% in the Catholic Church, 4% in Protestant churches, and 6% in public schools. And this was when the prevalence of this in the Catholic Church was at its highest. So even at its worst, the Catholic Church was still safer than public schools. Now, in 2002, the church enacted reforms to make sure they eradicated this completely. Some of those reforms included reporting all accusations of clerical abuse, no matter how long ago they occurred, to local law enforcement, establishing and maintaining a lay review board of local experts representing relevant professionals such as law enforcement, child protection, mental health to review all cases of reported abuse, participating in yearly audits by an independent and secular auditing firm to ensure that all dioceses follow the compliance efforts, removing all credibly accused clerics from ministry for life and keeping them away from the public, offering safe environment child protection training for all involved with the Catholic Church, including clerics, lay employees, volunteers, and even children. After implementing these reforms, the number of new cases each year dropped to about a dozen per year. And in the last 5 years, there has been an average of 1 new case per year. All of this leads Psychology Today to say, quote, "The church has gone from averaging about 660 new cases of abuse per year during the 1970s to about 1 new case per year since about 2014. That means the number of cases since 1970 to now have dropped 99.85%. That also means that out of the 37,000 priests in the United States, only 1 is accused annually of abuse, which is a rate of 0.003%. And the great thing about the Catholic Church is that its hierarchical structure allows it to enact these sweeping reforms from the top down, globally. The lack of a similar structure in Protestantism means it's very difficult to tackle these issues when they arise. Because even if they're fixed in one church in a particular denomination, that doesn't mean it's going to be the same in other churches in that denomination or in other denominations. So to recap this section, even at its worst, the rate of abuse of children in the Catholic Church was never higher than in the Protestant churches or in public schools. And unfortunately, this is an issue in every religion, but it has been almost entirely eliminated in the Catholic Church. Now, even a single case per year is unacceptable, and we should never stop improving until that number becomes 0 and remains 0. It should also be acknowledged that a lot of progress has been made, and annual new cases have been reduced by over 99%. And as is an apparent theme throughout this video, if priests were to just obey the Catholic Church's teachings, they wouldn't be committing these atrocities in the first place. So the issue isn't with Catholicism, the issue is with a diversion from Catholicism. The issue is with disobeying the Catholic Church. And the issue also is not with priests not being allowed to marry, because rates of this happening in Protestant churches where pastors are allowed to marry is the same. And lastly, just as high-profile cases among Protestant churches, Islamic schools, Buddhist temples, and Hindu gurus don't necessarily disprove those religions, nor define everyone in that religion, the same should be true for Catholicism, which now has almost no new cases of sexual abuse. Now, in all 3 of the topics we covered today, there are elements of truth in the accusation. Catholics have, in fact, been manipulated out of money in the past by priests, especially when priests were selling indulgences about 500 years ago. The Crusades and the Inquisition did in fact feature evil acts committed by Catholics. Priests have in fact harmed children. These are all facts. The falsehoods come in when we make blanket statements based on these facts. The Catholic Church is a financially corrupt institution. The Crusades were evil. The Spanish Inquisition was a World War II style era of religious persecution. The Catholic Church is not safe for children. All of these statements are simply false, as I've shown in this video. When it comes to finances, the church spends far more on charitable causes than all Protestant churches combined, and it's not even close. When it comes to the Crusades, the church exercised exemplary patience in waiting hundreds of years before defending itself against Islamic aggression. When it comes to the Spanish Inquisition, the church offered evidence-based trials in the place of witch hunts. And when it comes to child abuse, the church has almost entirely eradicated it and is now the safest place for children when compared to Protestant churches and public schools. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it or found it helpful, please make sure to like it and subscribe to the channel. If someone you know has made one or all of these accusations against the Catholic Church when you told them that you were Catholic, go ahead and send them this video and see if it changes their mind. And as always, until I see you next time, God bless.